Okay, so on to round 4. Meredith, you are up. What is your offering going to be?
I have a poem that picks up this theme of artists haunting their work or the work being haunted by the artist. The statue that I believe has now been removed in Charlottesville was begun by a sculptor whose work I became aware of, and I was quite haunted by his last words, which show up in the poem. His name was Henry Schrady, and this is called The Flaying. The statues we're now pulling down are hollow. The bronze is just a skin, portraying skin, a sculptor's ardor bottled up inside. Sometimes the casting captures fingerprints. I hear them topple and I watch the dust, the wisp that rises from the crumpled pelt. Somewhere I read of Henry Schrady dying, still begging his assistants, keep it wet, tormented by the clay he could not finish. He must have meant his Lee. His Grant was cast. He died 2 weeks before Grant was unveiled, a victim of the strain of that commission, which took him 20 years. It took his life. Another sculptor came to finish Lee, but found the clay had dried and deeply cracked, with all of Schrady's passion good for nothing. For centuries, we've melted down our heroes for canon, careful work from expert hands, attempts to make the human form undying, recast as hollow tubes to shatter bodies. Which hero killed him? For which side did he die? Perhaps he cast his lot quite early in the Grant Commission. With the cavalry charge, the first of 2 alarming charging tangles of arms and men and horses, war as hell, which flank impassive Grant up on his plinth. Here Schrady may be thinking of Bernini, who worked for his own mirrored face, for David, posed as the fallen horseman who'll be crushed. I'm glad we have a photograph of Schrady, safe in his studio with 2 small sons, absorbed in showing them his work, his face in shadowed silhouette, hands full of clay. The light, diffused like grace throughout the room, caresses the boys' cheeks, their wrinkled suits, the spotless floor, and spattered stands and tables. The dabbled clay around the looming model of another Union general on his horse, and Schrady's linen smock, his second skin.
Mm-hmm. Talk about the art killing you.
Yes, I was going to say
You bring that up there. Isn't it just the way of it, though, that if you're engaged in an activity that takes a long time to complete a work, it's very likely that you will die with something unfinished.
Yeah.
I think of the Michelangelo sculptures that he did in extreme old age that are unfinished and
Mhm.
almost, one is almost ruined. It's one of the Pietas where he's gone too far.
Yeah.
And you've humanized the progress of the sculptor in this poem, taking your cue from the photo, because it's not a photo of sort of the weight of the demands of the pursuit. It's not a gloomy photo about how hard it is and you're going to pass,
Yeah.
and they won't even be able to save the work you did up to that point, that the clay will dry out and they'll just have to toss it. It's different. It's kind of a domestic thing, but I mean, how do you feel about this this guy is essentially engaged in the kind of activity that you're engaged in. Do you identify with him in
Oh, yes.
any? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. And the fact that he was sculpting Grant and then sculpting Lee and then sculpting another general, he was just doing the work. Although his passion was for this Grant Memorial, which is on the National Mall. It's right in front of the US Capitol. And when the Capitol was stormed on January 6th, they came charging around that thing with Grant up on a pedestal, a plinth, and then these two masses of sculpture on either side. Yeah, I sure I identify with him. And the expensive spirit in this work, which I think was probably too much in his case, although I think he was also ill or became ill. But there he is with his sons, you know, showing them with pride how to work clay, what it is. I'm glad that the Confederate monuments are being removed. I'm even glad that some of them are being destroyed, but I'm also sorry because I know how much work went into them. But I wouldn't want them preserved except in some way in which they could be thoroughly interpreted and explained, and every ounce of the horrible racism that went into their creation explained and illuminated. So that's a lot to ask, and maybe it's better to just get rid of them. But
It's a lot of context.
Sculptor's work. Yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot of but I agree with you. It's only if you could somehow also recreate the context so that the work itself could be understood in the context of that time, so that we could understand it in the context of our own time. And it is asking a lot. I think, though, that it ought to be at least the aim of public things like this to be accompanied by an attempt to educate the population about that context. And I don't know the best way to do it if you remove them into a space where you have more control and create a kind of a multimedia experience that people would get into nowadays that would let them understand why this isn't out on the mall.
Yeah.
Changing the subject entirely, but keeping on the subject of public art. A couple of years ago, there was a very interesting event that told me a lot about public art. I think said a lot about public art. And that is when the Fearless Girl statue was placed in front of the Bull on Wall Street, or on Broadway near Wall Street.
Yep.
And the artist he died shortly after this, but he was just, you know, horrified. And I felt that it was like, it was a real desecration of public art, which should be open to interpretation rather than assigned a meaning. Again, I'm talking about public art generally. People, when that happened, said, "Oh," in the way that most Americans, I have to admit, most Americans, you know, feel like they need to be instructed before they go to a museum. They now know, oh, well, that's what that statue is about. It was assigned, you know, the role of representing testosterone on Wall Street, which is a completely plausible reading. But there are many other impressions that you can get from it. And it was just usurped. It was sort of hijacked by that statue of a little girl, which eventually and is now moved in front of the stock exchange, where I think it's just doing a glorious job, you know, because that's not public art. That's the actual enemy right there, you know.
Yeah.
But when that happened, it just, you know, it sort of really brought up this whole question of interpreting public art and the necessity of an open interpretation objective subjectivity. Obviously, when you're looking at President Grant and a statue, this is, you know, the hero of the Civil War, etc. Everyone knows that. But it's like all art, you know, it should be open.
Yeah, that was an example where the placing of the second statue of the girl recontextualized the space and diminished the opportunities of reaction instead of enlarge them.
Right.
So if there were a way to
That's what I-
enlarge them, yeah, I'm saying it in a different way of what
No, no,
you
that's
said.
that's my point.
That-
Yeah, you're right. You're right.
That's the problem, is that it narrowed down the way you could react to that space. And
And
that's not a
you know,
good.
I don't agree. I've met Arturo de Modica, and he was very full of himself and very proud of his act of civic mischief, which was placing the bull there in the first place, without permission. And the city finally adopted it. So to have the girl added, however temporarily, seemed delightful to me. And I don't feel that it took away anything from the bull, who was, you know, 5 times as large and had been there for a long time, and I didn't feel was at all threatened by her. Quite the opposite. But I'm glad she's got her own space, because yes, to have her just standing up to the bull was kind of cute, but limited. So
I
I'm glad
remember
she's-
thinking that if she was removed by the people that put her there after a certain amount of time, that would have been more effective. But I just felt that it was assigning, you know, the artist's original intent, or by attacking it, which I thought was a usurpation of the artist's work. I don't know as much about the sculptor of the bull as you do. I do know that it was a prank to start with. That's
Yeah.
right. Yeah.
Well, people are often leaving things. There was a bust of Edward Snowden out in Prospect Park, I think, for a while, an enormous one, that was very promptly removed by the Parks Department or by the city, that somebody had made and left there. And this happens from time to time. And it's kind of part of contemporary art and civic life, and I think it's fun. But, you know, the things that Henry Schrady was making were very earnest and very specific political statements, civic pride statements. And the bull was much more a sculpture put outdoors. There's a difference between civic sculpture and public art, which can often be temporary, is often funny, and that's very refreshing, surprising, even silly. I love the stuff that the Public Art Fund puts up in Doris Friedman Plaza, near the Plaza Hotel at the corner of Central Park. There's a corner where they put temporary sculptures for 6 months or a year, facing the gorgeous monument, Civil War monument by Augustus St. Gaudens of Sherman on his horse. You know, Sherman, the great destroyer of Atlanta, the Union general. But they put up once a huge stone stele, a big plinth of stone with words engraved on it very deeply and beautifully. And the words said, asparagus, milk, paper towels, butter. You know, it's a shopping list, basically. And it was very funny. And it was there for its period, and then it moved on. So they do a lot of things like that. And I think the bull is more like that, except he won a permanent place. So I don't mind people spoofing him.
Well, I can tell you there's still very long lines to see the bull. I used to work right, I would almost trip over the bull when I walked into my building.
Okay.
And the longer line, of course, is at the rear of the bull. But you know, he still remains popular. And Fearless Girl is just resplendent in front of the stock exchange.
Good.
Or I hope she remains for.
I'm glad that ended happily. Nobody got gored.
Um, so Meredith just read. That means you're on your next to last offering, Rick. What do you have for us?
Okay, I'm going to save the lines one, which you mentioned for the last. So I'm going to I'm going to read Lafitte's From a Pencil Sketch.
Okay, so hang on a moment and I will pull it up.
Great.
This gets more into the brass tacks of like how you make the sausage, I guess.
That's always a
I
good
hope
thing.
there are no tacks in my sausages.
Oh, please.
All right. As you mentioned, Lafitte's is a bar in New Orleans, which claims to be the longest continuing operating bar in North America, and it is an old blacksmith shop, and named after the pirate who used it to divvy up the booty or whatever. Lafitte's From a Pencil Sketch, French Quarter, New Orleans. I placed her as a lighthouse in the fog of graphite on my way to rent a car and drive to Baton Rouge. Her little dog pulled hard, all right, but didn't get too far. A thumbnail on St. Philip Street is all. I faced her toward the river in a shirt or a mid-length camisole. That's all I had to work with in a minute's time and dirt. She gives the composition something bad to hold against a shadow on the wall. Old blacksmith bar, the far end of the quarter, and a sky that begs an August hurricane. Her melody already underwater, she will be the souvenir refrain, the shade of grace responding to a call. That is the painting that I did from the pencil sketch, which, as hinted in the poem, was a quickie on my way to rent a car and drive to Baton Rouge.
Nice painting.
Was it post Katrina?
Post Katrina, yes, but didn't look much different than pre. I've been there many times pre and post. It's easy. It's
Okay,
easier to paint from a quick and dirty pencil sketch when you know the place too. So this is partly from memory. But the woman that's referred to in the poem is the one to the right, with the blue, wearing the blue paint, and walking the little white dog, who is, I guess she's not really the focal point in the painting. You tend to go toward the human figure. You got the two hipsters on the other side of the corner. But she's like the tent pig, I guess, just to hold the image down.
The shadow on the wall, is that in the painting?
No. I've never thought about that, but that did not come out in the painting, at least not a shadow of any of the figures. Yeah.
It's such an interesting idea, something bad to hold against the shadow.
Yeah.
I like that very much. I love the painting, and the sky really is, as all your skies are, quite alive and wonderful.
Yeah, well, I mean, the skies over New Orleans, even on on most days, is sort of active and often shoveled under coal.
Rick, the ending of the poem is beautiful, and I'm reading it as both the city and the female figure.
Yes.
Word her. Was that something?
Yeah, she's sort of like the spirit of the city. Or it could be read that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's who she's she's a battered figure, holding up as best she can.
Yeah. And of course, the problem there was that there was no response to the call.
Right.
The aid didn't arrive and didn't arrive and didn't arrive.
Right. And call and response, of course, is Al can tell us a lot about this. It's song and music in New Orleans. It's a very important tradition.
Yeah. I mean, it's grounded in religious activities, but then it found its way into the secular music of the city, and it's just one of those, one of those universal techniques that then went out into the jazz world and beyond throughout the country and throughout the world. The whole
Right.
the whole idea of call and response.
And I think
The
significantly through that route took its course through New Orleans, in the earliest New Orleans jazz, the call and response.
yes, yeah. So well, for me, the building itself is like a character, and the battered nature of the building with the brick showing through, I guess, what was there, kind of a thin layer of something over the bricks that's now.
Yeah, whatever they put over the bricks. I mean, it is a very old building, and it was a blacksmith shop. That chimney in the middle is off of a forge, which you can see in the front door, the sort of orange brown.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever been there. It's at the far end of Bourbon Street and away from most of the ruckus. But it's become more and more post-Katrina. It's become more and more infiltrated with the hurricane drinkers.
What's a hurricane drinker?
There's a drink that they give you on Bourbon Street called a hurricane. And then that big truck has to come and clean up after you throw up all over the street in the morning. Yeah, Bourbon Street Bourbon Street has to be seen, but not spent a lot of time on when you go to New Orleans.
Okay.
I'll take that back. There are a couple of good clubs on Bourbon Street.
Well, Beale Street in Memphis is also not what it was. I can attest to that.
Ain't nothing what it was.
Yeah, and I wasn't there when it was what it isn't now. But I can tell what it is now isn't what it was.
And as we delve into more tourist information, go to Frenchman Street when you're in New Orleans if you want to hear music.
Really? All right, good to know.
The quarter. That's not like 2 blocks out of the quarter.
Don't know if I'll be there anytime soon, but it's good to know. I've never been, although God knows I've been influenced very deeply by generations worth of music from New Orleans.
It's the
from early jazz.
It's the quintessential.
Yeah, it's there's 8 but the 1. Well, I guess I should. The thing that I have to read, I have to apologize in advance. It's a poem about an experience that relatively few people have ever had, because in order to have it, you have to be a latter-day recording musician who works with contemporary recording techniques. And I don't expect that to be all that clear when I read the poem, what's actually happening. Unless you live it, it isn't going to make a whole lot of sense. But the lesson that comes through, I think, will come through without your knowing the details that you're being told, without you being able to make sense of those details. You'll still be able to make sense of the overall lesson, I think, quite easily. The poem is called Punch Drunk, and the reference is to what in the modern day where we have the ability to do, which is to add something to something that's already recorded. And what we say is that we punch in and we punch out. So if you're in the middle of a piece, the moment that you punch in, what you record will write over what was there before. So essentially, it's like if you were doing a painting and you chose to paint over what you already had, except you're doing it in sound. Punch drunk. During a long day's tracking, near to quitting, familiar demons slip into the room. Around the microphone, my horn. and me. I play a chorus, and the engineer says, 2 notes in that middle phrase weren't up to pitch. I'll get you in 2 bars before it. My solo picks up in the cans. These are the cans. 2 bars, and I'm punched in to play the phrase again. I do. We listen back. The same 2 notes are out. We cue it up again. I blow the phrase, lip up the vagrant notes. We listen back. No dice. After a few more futile passes, I sense I'm too tired out. So I suggest I just make up a different phrase to fill the gap. We roll it back. I play another phrase. I like it and it fits, but now it seems a later note's a little out. That is, the engineer hears it as flat, but I can't. So we listen back again. We've reached the stage where we're not sure of sharp or flat, but still can tell that something's wrong. It's a good sign to knock off for the day. But I say, let me take just one more shot. This time, I don't come in at all. I pause and say, the same place again. I hear my solo again. I don't come in because I can't tell where I am. It seems my solo jumps ahead all of a sudden, past the note that cues me to begin. Either my mind is giving way or the recording app is dropping out. The engineer assures me that's impossible. He must be right. The demons are in play. I know by now not to try to fight them. So although it means I've lost my mind, I make no protest. I simply ask to hear my solo from the top, and that I be punched in whenever he needs to do it. I repeat the lines from the beginning, and that breaks the spell. Later on, I realize my mind was skipping back to the old punching cue, except those notes I'd blown before had vanished from the track when I changed up my solo. We can't erase the present and replace it, but memory reminds us that the past is in us still, insisting it exists. So punch drunk is very appropriate because you get to where you just become stupid.
Mhm. Yeah.
And you can't, but as is usually the case, you always figure you'll get it the next time. So you always want to do it again. And this is, by the way, this is a moment where your producer, if she or he is in the booth, is in the control room, says, let's call it for the day. You're probably not going to get it. And no, I'm going to get it right the next time.
Yeah.
Discretion can be the better part of valor.
Yeah.
Your brain gets tired.
I have a visual thing like that. If I'm working on a hand, sometimes I'll think I'm between one finger and I'm really between another finger, or if there's folds of drapery that repeat and I don't want them to be too regular, I'll sometimes just be working, I'll look away, and then when I look back, I can't tell where I am because they are too regular. It's just a visual tiredness thing, and I have to stop and use my eyes for something else for a few minutes because I just can't shake the repetitive spacing thing.
So do you reach a point where looking away as a refresher is not, you're past the point of even that helping you,
Oh, sure.
and you really ought to quit? Okay, so now the real question I have for you is, do you then just stubbornly go on a little more because you think you think you're better off than you are?
Yeah.
Well, that's good because
been doing a lot of drawing recently. I have a drawing project. I'm actually doing an illustrated poetry book, and I hadn't done drawing in a long time. And I started, doing it late at night. One night we had a false alarm, burglar alarm. We were up at 4:30 in the morning, And rather than go back to bed, I sat down and started drawing again. And I was obviously too tired to be doing it, but I was so into the project that I kept pushing. It
And
happens.
can you see
It's not a
that?
good
Can
idea.
you see that in the result? Can you look at it and say, you know, I was past it when I was doing this?
Yes, but I was working in pencil, so I can go back and fix it before I do pen and ink over that. Yeah.
Okay, that's good to hear.
There's something in the poem
Anyway,
of Cut One, Side One, Album One of Steely Dan, which you'll recall tells us that you go back, Jack, do it again, wheel turning round and round.
Mhm.
yes, yeah, it's.
They
I
should
don't
have
know if it
stopped
came
there.
across what happens in your head, but the thing is, in order to, there's nothing that tells you when to come in, when they go back and do it again, and then you have to come in and play the thing that you want to fix. There's nothing that tells you that there's a little light that tells you now is the time for you to play. You got to feel it. And
Mhm.
when your internal navigation and compass goes awry, I literally froze. I didn't know when to come in. And that's when we had to investigate it a little bit further. So anyway, that's one of those poems that I like to write, poems that nobody else is writing, because you have to have had my particular twists and turns in my life to have had the experience that I'm writing about. So I'm happy that neither of you has had to have that particular kind of feeling lost, even though
No,
there are other kinds.
it's notable that, you know, we've got a little time before AI takes us over, because artificial intelligence cannot do hands. You know, we need people with your
Yes.
expertise, Meredith.
Yes, now.
Yes. I'm grateful for that.
I was just a little time.
Well, let's not dwell on chaos. Final round. Let's attack the final round here, and
Okay.
and don't worry about time passing, because I'm really enjoying this. And if I just carve it into 2 episodes instead of 1, I do that all the time. So
Okay.
take your time, but give us your best.
Okay. I'm up.
You got it. You
All
are.
right. I have not written much about sculpting. I just didn't have ideas for poems, but I had written one a few years ago that was actually quite a few years ago. And it was a disaster, so I picked it up again and rewrote it. I used to wonder a lot why I needed to perfect the surfaces of my sculpture, which has, given me these hands that are red and lumpy and overworked. And part of it is just needing to see the form defined before I know what I get. But I used to beat myself up. Why can't you sculpt like Rodin? What's wrong with you? The rough surface is so much more expressive and appealing to art historians and art critics. They don't want to see something that mimics ancient sculpture. They want to see something modern and vigorously sculpted. And I would just keep coming back to this. Why do you keep kind of finishing the form? And I finally came to understand that it's part of who I am and my upbringing and my character, that I like this. I actually feel reassured. I understand it. It makes sense to me. And why it makes sense to me, I began to get at in this poem. So the title refers to the Jewish tradition of marking the anniversary of someone's death, specifically parents' death, usually. Yahrzeit. I step back. These breasts look almost right, their curves compressed by the pose. But I hear my mother, father, commenting on my surface, on my shape. What parent doesn't prize their child's perfection? In clay, however, a smooth skin chills the form. Imagining bronze, I scrape a shaky crosshatch, a broken mesh of slubs, a louder texture. Defying my dead, I sculpt these rougher, warmer. Is this now more like life? How a bosom breathes, how arms encompass a ribcage and its heart? I cannot hear this figure's answer yet. Who cares but me? Who asks for harder labor? I work the clay until the echoes falter. Let no one's loving voice, however gentle, ask if I'd yet see today's fresh pimple, or had I thought to try a padded bra, or anything about my body proper. Alone, let me be mother and creator. Let it not matter that I don't hide my pallor. Let love that shaped me rest inside each piece. I would not be, again, somebody's daughter.
There's a lot in there.
Good.
Mm. I mean, I've never encountered anybody making a connection between how they've experienced their own body in the context of their own childhood and youth in connection with an activity that creates a body,
Mm-hmm.
that there's a relationship between the living body and the one that's being sculpted, that this brings us back to what has gone on and is going on within the living body. It's very, I mean, it's revealing in a way that I've never encountered. Of course, I don't know any other sculptor poets. I don't know. Have you read Michelangelo's poetry in Italian? He wrote a lot.
Yes, he sometimes writes in the voice of his sculptures as if they were speaking.
Really?
Yeah, and people go around saying that all of one's sculptures are self-portraits. That's why the flaying is, about the sculptor inhabiting the skin of the sculpture. But I had never tried to make a connection between a problematic way of working or something I felt was problematic and something not exactly traumatic, but problematic in my upbringing. I read
it's that.
And he said, "Oh, this is why you criticize me." I thought, "Oh boy, I'm passing it on."
Well, it's exactly the kind of poem that I hoped we'd have for this conversation, because it really does bring things down to the point where the work comes from and through the artist and is conditioned by the experience of the artist. And I don't mean the experience of the subject, but the experience of the one engaging with the subject.
And with all the whirlwind and nonsense around art, the best thing you could say about somebody's work is that it's honest. And this poem is, sort of
it's honest in spades.
Description of the connection between you and your work, and in a world in which you're challenged for over your expression and choices that you make. I mean, just doing some representative art is still, frowned upon. It's not the 1970s anymore. you know, it's not easy. And a lot of people are not producing honest work because of the pressures of the market and, you know,
Yeah. This
and other
poem
pressures.
probably took me 12 or 13 years. I realized I started writing it when I was working on my September 11th sculpture, which was finished in 2012, the enlargement for the cathedral. And that's where, you know, the breasts are compressed by the pose.
Mm.
And that was a whole issue, how to have a nude female sculpture in a cathedral and make it not exactly decent, but make it a statement rather than a girly sculpture. But then I put it away for a decade or more, and it just never quite worked. So ideas do come from old botched attempts, old failures. And
What
yeah,
made you bring it back when you did?
I necessity. I'm in two monthly poetry groups, and I had to have something, and this thing had just kind of gnawed at me. It was sitting in a file, and I thought I could do better. You know, this is not pulling its weight. This is not a good poem. So I just took it apart.
You know, I wouldn't put Richard Wilbur in the same boat as John Singer Sargent, but he did once say that if a poem isn't working, he rips it up and throws it away. I hope I'm not getting him wrong. I could never understand that. I could never understand that, especially when you're talking about a poem, and you know, I guess some are so bad you might throw them away. But the idea that something fails immediately, I
Oh, I have
really.
a lot of those.
Hmm?
Half ideas that have been sitting in a file or something. But Richard Wilbur was only a poet. I mean, he also taught and he translated and wrote plays, but he was in that world full time.
Yeah.
And when I'm working on commissions and things like that, I'm not necessarily thinking poetically at all. So stuff does get set aside. And of course, Richard Wilbur was brilliant and just a fountain of erudition and sources and ideas, and
I
if you
was disappointed that he didn't show up in the movie Maestro.
yes,
I was waiting to see
Uh,
who played Richard Wilbur.
that would have been fun.
well, the description that you give reminds me that there is a difference between work that is um, uh, failed and or abandoned and work that is simply unfinished.
Well, you don't always
Um,
know.
no, and I have the daddy of that story, at least in the context of my life, and I've told it on other shows, but I'm going to tell it quickly here again because it is very unusual. Is that I started out writing fiction, and I wrote two novels and part of a third when I was in my early to mid 20s, and my second novel was almost published by Doubleday, but they changed their mind at the last minute, and I was glad that they did because I was never happy with the ending. I just thought I knew there was something wrong with the ending. It wasn't what the ending needed to be, but I had no idea what it should be. So I put it away, and then I moved on to other things, and I didn't really come back to writing long fiction works because once I started teaching, much like what you're talking about, Meredith, I didn't have the time or the energy for long things of any kind. So I gravitated towards writing poems and songs, which could be the work of an afternoon on a weekend or on a vacation or in the summer. But a novel you've got to work at for hours daily. And I couldn't do that when I was teaching. Anyway, 46 years went by after I put this novel on the shelf. And I woke up one day and suddenly said, oh, I know what the ending has to be. But I mean, I don't I don't write novels anymore. So I decided, well, now, of course, I'm writing poetry. So what I'm going to do is to rewrite the novel as a long narrative poem and put in the ending that I think is correct. And the way that I went about it was not to look at the novel. It was to just go on my memory of the story. And so I just wrote it as a poem, and came to the end and gave it the ending that I had suddenly figured out was the correct one. And now I feel very good about it. Whereas for 46 years, it was kind of that thing that I didn't want to talk about.
Well, Horace, of course, advises us to put our poems in the drawer for 9 years before we look at
Really?
them again.
I'm lucky if I can
I'll
keep.
come across paintings that I did years ago that I thought were horrible and had something worthwhile, and vice versa. But it's wonderful when you have the ones that you just didn't think were worth keeping, and you see something in them.
Mhm.
It's
Yeah,
hard to know immediately whether something's good.
Mhm.
yeah. I'm very grateful that I didn't start making my own records of my own songs until I was 50, because people don't get to hear what I was writing when I was 28.
Uh-huh.
And you're not, at the time, I would have used my best work at the time, and I'm glad nobody has to hear that now. So if I didn't have it together by 50, then shame on me. It was a late start, but not an unwelcome one.
Doesn't matter.
Well, both of you have talked about gaps when you didn't come to poetry until later. And Rick, in your case, you didn't come to painting until later. And yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. As long as you get it done somehow, somewhere, at some point. Okay, last one up, Rick. This has got to be lines. Is that correct?
That is it. That's all I got.
Okay, so let me pull it up. And share it. There you go.
All right. This is dedicated to John Trouse, who he and I often get into sometimes public face-offs on certain facts, and he insisted it was someone other than Horace, who, for example, who said to wait 9 years.
Mhm.
And we once went around on whether there are lines in nature. So I ended up dedicating this to John J. Trouse, a good friend and good poet. Lines. For working always beyond our own intelligence, Les Murray. For John J. Trouse. We like to think it starts with an idea, but it's a line that leads us to the gates. The unexamined twist of DNA, a novelty that recapitulates according to the fine print on the signs that catch our eyes. The whispered footnote sings much closer to the soul than to the mind as gravity kicks in, creating rings as rooms arise. We enter here to find the hidden logic of our own designs. It tends to happen on a train or at the wheel, or in the moment we awake midair in clouds and contrails on a raft of steel. The image forms a gesture in the flare. There are no lines in nature, but the lines.
Mm-hmm.
It's wonderful.
Yeah, and there's mystery. I always love mystery in poems. And for me, there's mystery in this, even though I can follow the physical circumstances
Mhm.
at different parts of the poem where it comes. Still, the mystery of origin is there. I couldn't help wondering, though, if the other kind of line plays any role. which is to say the poetic line. Do you sometimes start
Right.
poems because you have a line?
Most of my poems
The
start
first
with a
line.
line. Yeah, I just find that most of my poems, I'll come up with a line of iambic pentameter, as it turns out, will occur to me. And
Yeah.
and I realize that it occurred to me because there's something cooking, you know, and it might not be the first line or the last line. It might not even end up in the poem, but that's how I get started very often, if not all the time.
Mhm.
Yeah. That's,
Mhm.
by the way, the counterpoint to that for me is that it often happens that way with poems, but it pretty much always happens that way for me with songs, which is that I start with a line or a phrase, and I know the melody, and I feel the rhythm, and then once I feel the rhythm, that's the equivalent of knowing that you're in iambic pentameter, for example. I can then forecast what how I must proceed musically, and my songs spool out of that. Often it's the first line, but also often it's the hook line that becomes the title to the song. That is the repeated part that is the most memorable. But yeah, it very much comes to me either as the very beginning or the high point of something. And if it's a high point, I have to backtrack and figure out what came before it and what might come after. But yeah, it's interesting to me where we get our ideas. And Rick, you said to me in an earlier conversation that what was it you said, that painting and poetry have nothing to do with each other? Did you say that?
Yeah. No, I said that that's something to think about. You know, on the level that, you know, you never read a Wallace Stevens poem about selling insurance.
No. Boy, are they not about selling insurance.
They're bound to each other, you know, but that being the case, it's often interesting to think about like how they are completely different from each other. Anyway, I chose this image for that poem because obviously there are no lines to the extent of maybe there being a question of whether it's not an abstract painting, and
Mhm.
I'm going to say it's not. I mean, it's meant to be a landscape.
I mean, what comes to me is a superimposition, is things on top of things as opposed to lines. And it's so chewy. I mean,
Yeah,
it's chewy.
I
It's the
see
only word I can
interlocking
use.
things, or shapes
Yep.
interlocking, shapes meshed together. The paint even comes up over the edge. It's wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I do see a sky and a horizon, maybe a cloud, and then ocean breaking over rocks or something.
Yeah. Well, that's a way to see it, isn't it? It's
Maybe.
not the only way to see it, but
Yeah,
that's legit for sure.
yeah. There's something
Although that may
delicate
not be
about
what
it.
you had in mind, Rick, but you can't tell people how to see your
You know,
work,
yeah,
right?
I mean, this is something that um, I approached with no intent or consciousness that I would actually finish a picture.
Mhm.
You know, the paint had been sitting around for a while. I mean, right now, for the first time ever, I see a minotaur in it.
Wow.
Every time I look at pictures,
Mhm.
I see things that Chaim Soutine, who I've written about, you'll often look at his pictures, and pictures you've seen many, many times, you'll see figures in them that clearly were not his intention, you know, but they're there and then they disappear. And sometimes they'll show up when you
Huh.
photograph the picture, but they're not in the picture when you look at the picture.
Huh.
Yeah.
Really? That's interesting.
It doesn't happen to me with John Singer Sargent. I will, however, tell you one anecdote about John Singer Sargent that redeems him. He once
Oh,
said,
that's very fair of you.
I'm going to pull him out of the big hole I threw him in. He
Great.
once said, A portrait is any picture that has something wrong with the mouth.
Oh, yes.
Really?
It's brilliant because,
Yeah.
yeah, sure, the mouth is hard to paint, but I think what he was just saying that, every time he paints one of these society folk who he was commissioned to paint, they always said there's something wrong with the mouth.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah.
We had a
Because
sense
they've
of
got to
humor.
say,
He had a sense of humor.
He's Boston's favorite son. I just saw a big exhibition about Sargent and fashion at the Museum of
Sorry,
Fine Art.
I didn't hear what you
I-
said. I'm sorry.
I hear you. Hmm?
I didn't hear what you said. I'm sorry.
Oh, he's Boston's favorite son, John
Oh, I
Singer
know.
Sargent.
Uh-huh. Oh,
Big,
yeah.
big exhibit at the MFA I just saw, but which I enjoyed, but I had to work at it, I must say. So I hear you about John Singer Sargent.
not a lot of surprise there, huh?
I'm too hard on John Singer Sargent, I'll admit it. But Matisse was better when his sitter said it didn't look like me. He
Mhm.
said it's not a picture of you, which is an awful lot to think about and also gets us off the hook more than once.
Yeah, that is good.
Say that again?
A sitter told Matisse when he looked at the picture, it doesn't look like me. And Matisse's response was, it's not a picture of you. Almost as good as Pablo Picasso
Mhm.
when Gertrude Stein said, it doesn't look like me. And he said, it will. And he was right.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
Later in life. Yes.
I've had that experience with the statue of Phyllis Wheatley because there's only one image of her, an engraving in profile, and I had to come up with a face full round.
Mhm.
And I had many different women pose for her and groped and searched, and it's become a kind of iconic figure, which is wonderful. So now she
Now they
looks,
just have AI do it.
yeah, well, it's so interesting in your poem, Rick, that you're traveling towards something when you find this line. And in Al's poem, he's stationary. He makes a space and the thing appears to him.
That's for writing. That's for like a poem. But as my final poem will deal with action, with creating in action in time. I can't just wait for something to appear. I have to lure it out of the cave. So, well, maybe I should go to that.
Yeah.
Let me see. The way that this is going to work is that I have a poem called Playing the Solo. And what I'm trying to do in the poem, because I hadn't really seen anybody else do it, and again, it's the kind of thing that unless you're an improvising musician and a poet, you're probably not going to bother trying to guess what goes through the mind of the improviser when she or he is actually at it. But this, in a way, it's all wrong because you don't think. So when I talk about it in terms of thinking, it's really not thinking so much as it is a succession of moments and levels of different kinds of awareness. And so in language, I'm stating those different levels of awareness, but stating them is not the same as experiencing them. And so this is a poor substitute for what goes on in my mind, but it's limited by the nature of language itself. So that's what I'm going to hide behind. Playing the solo. To start, you have to choose a note to play. The first question is not which one, but when. the chord you play it over helps you choose. And then how long to hold it and what shape to give it, straight or bent or with vibrato. Where do you go next? Jump up or down, and by how much? Or play the first again and right away, or do you leave a space? The chord you play it over helps you choose, but time is moving and the chord may change. And so you have to listen to the band, and in the meantime, listen to yourself. This exercise of putting notes together may make you think of others that you've heard. So you may go that way a while and play something familiar you can execute. Or you may let it pass and pick a note that sends you in a different direction and play things that you never have before. At the same time this is happening, you're not thinking at all exactly, only playing and reacting, listening inside your head and outside all at once, your mind a blank, and feeling your way through. And feeling the emotion of the moment, and singing it or dancing it, your sound and steps made out of notes and silence. But first, you find your way to feel the time, because after you know the chords and scales, you understand the possibilities and what at any moment is implied. Strive to be always open to the moment. Most players play around with chords and scales and fill the air with notes and sound the same. Only a few can play around with time, and everyone who does is different. That's also a kind of credo for me, because I think time first. And relatively few jazz players do that. They usually think harmony first. So now I read the poem, and I'm kind of interested in your take on it. But once we've done that, then I'm going to share the screen and give an example of a solo of mine that I think is a very good illustration of the things that I've been talking about. And I think you can hear that in the way it's constructed. But I don't know, does any of this sound, is there anything you could hook onto given the kind of work that you both do that's similar to any of this?
Sure. Yeah, I look at a sculpture in progress and I ask myself what to do next, what needs my correction, but it's not just correction, it's what needs more, what needs to blossom more, what needs more form, more assertion. So I'm kind of asking it questions, which I think you are also doing.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And I do that in other kinds of, again, if I'm writing a play, I do that all the time. So what is the character feeling? What is she going to do next? That all happens. But I don't write a play in real time, thank God. This is the problem with a jazz solo, is that they keep pushing you forward and you've got to come up with an answer every moment. Sometimes your answer is silence, but nonetheless, how long you hold the silence, sooner or later, you've got to keep making another decision. And that's the tricky part. Now, nowadays, we've got this recording process that allows us to go back and have second thoughts. So that becomes more like the kinds of things that we do when we ask the questions in our own time. But still, the nature of it is that everything that you're playing has to be, it's not going to wait for you. It's like log rolling. You got to be up on the log. You can't get behind. You can't get ahead, or you're in the drink. But yeah, of course, it's always questions. Always questions and answers.
A very important principle of all art, I think, is I guess that you would say gesture, sort of a movement from one spot to the next.
Yeah.
being part of a whole, and all things working in that area. And in a sense, that's a matter of working over time too, to get from one spot to the next. But there's like balance and direction, and a number of ways to express it. But there needs to be something going on with those trees, with those clouds, with the notes and the silences. And time is really the essence of music. I mean, the band is only as good as its drummer, but
Yep.
to me, it's a matter of movement, not simply that doesn't have any extraneous element to it, but that the whole has a gesture and an integrity in that regard.
That's the goal. Yeah, you're exactly right. That is, you're trying to do all those things, and you're trying to do it now, and then again and again and again and again. It's not the kind of thing that you can do consciously very well. So you have to get to the point where you're functioning unconsciously and you're just hearing and reacting, hearing and reacting. It's not that different from what happens in basketball, where you have to learn how to read a defense and know what your options are, but you don't have time to think. You've got to read it. They call it read and react in basketball, and that's a good phrase to describe what we have to do when we play. But yeah, in that sense, it's all the same. There's a famous quote in a Bill Evans album from Bill Evans, where he says that there's a Japanese art form that, and you may know it, that requires you to not ever lift the tip of your brush or your pen up once you put it onto the surface. So, and he's saying that's like improvising, that once you put it down, then you've got to do it all from that point, and you can't stop and start again. And he talks about it as an extremely compressed form of discipline that he sees as a kind of a model for what he's trying to do in his own playing.
Yeah.
Which is it's a great goal. I mean, it's a lifetime goal. I practiced a lot more during COVID, and my playing got better. And now I can kind of play what I want. I've been playing for 60 years, more than 60 years. I've been improvising. I've been improvising for 50 years. And now I am starting to be able to do it. It's like what Hokusai said, when he said, nothing I did before the age of 70 was of any value. Now I'm 80 and I'm just starting to get it. You know this quote? He says, if I can only live to be 100, every line that I write, every line will be alive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
May we
I'm not going to make it to
music?
100. Yeah, let me share it. And this is a solo that I like. I like them all up to a point, but this is one I really like. So let's see if I can get this to work. So you can see the screen, okay?
Mm-hmm.
I believe I'm sharing sound, so let me know if you don't hear it, please.
it's quiet in the darkness.
Hmm.
It's not a happy song, as you can tell.
When I first heard it, it made me think of New Orleans.
Well, that's where it starts.
All
There's
right.
traditional elements to it that, I mean, and this is an interesting point. A solo isn't necessarily, just scattered, and you're working within a tradition the whole time you're doing it, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, this is, and also I work, I mean, I'm not what you would call an innovator in the sense that I create new forms and music that sounds unlike anything you've ever heard before. I'm always trying to come up with something personal within a tradition and extend the tradition while remaining true to the essence of the tradition. And so it's so the more you know about the history of that music, the more you could tell the ingredients that went into what I'm doing. But I don't really play like anybody else. And that's one of the goals.
But this is something that you're rewarded by. The more you know, the more you're rewarded in experiencing it. But you shouldn't need to. For example, I think it was Branford Marsalis was commenting on McCoy Tyner, and said that McCoy Tyner was full of crap because McCoy Tyner said that you have to like know what I'm doing before you. He said Marsalis said I don't have to go out and like catch balls for a half an hour before I go to a baseball game. That you should be able to go in and enjoy it.
You do if you're going to play it at Branford.
The more you're familiar with the tradition, the more you can say, "Oh, I hear Louis Armstrong, or that's Basin Street, but the mood and the atmosphere don't require that."
No, they not to listen and to appreciate what's going on, but if you're going to, I mean, I don't know what your all philosophies about the artistic disciplines that you've learned are, but I mean, the old school approach, which has gone back, I don't know, hundreds, thousands of years, is you've got to learn, you've got to learn and master all the rules before you set about breaking them. That's not a fashionable idea anymore, but it is kind of the value system that I came up in and that people of my generation came up in. But as musically, I'm a throwback in somewhat the same way that as poets, we're throwbacks because we write in form. We're going back to values that were were popular in an earlier time. And we don't see any reason.
The flame, I mean, we're not rediscovering anything, there's always been form,
Yeah.
I think that I don't think we'll be able to say that 30 years from now, frankly, but up till now, there's a straight line going back to the cave paintings.
Yeah, I find
well, I think you may be right, but please go ahead.
The more I study the traditions, the more ideas I get, the more tools I have. So that's useful to me. There are plenty of artists who don't feel they need those tools, that they can simply assimilate or quote or assemble. But if I'm going to make something from scratch that's full of references, I feel I have to have mastered those references. I have to really understand them. So I keep reading and studying and looking to have those tools.
Yeah, see, I feel like I have to study the whole history of jazz trumpet, for example. So I go back to the earliest recordings, and I want to know how to play the way they did in 1925, 1935, 1945, 1955. I want to know everything that it's possible for me to know. But this is not the prevailing mindset of our time. So,
Brief interjection. It's after 11 and my household is up in arms because we have to get up. early
let's
tomorrow.
conclude the proceedings. I'm more than happy to do so because this has been really so rewarding, and I thank you both. And we should all live and be well. So thanks. I'll say good night.
This was
Thank you, Al. Thank you, Rick. It's been a pleasure.
Oh
Good night,
boy.
folks.
Yep.